session. So how do you guys, if you can hear me, how do you guys think we should begin? I just need someone to make a guess.
Sir, just to be clear, do you mean begin this session or begin
Yes.
the entire retreat?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so if it's begin this session, I don't know. I actually don't know what the structure is like, but I would just suggest that maybe we have discussions around like some of the most recent struggles that we've been having in writing and all that. Maybe we could just start there. That's my suggestion.
Okay. Thank you, Collins. Well, beginning this session is, of course, beginning the retreat, because the retreat starts with this session. But I think if you're doing a writing cohort, the best way to start, or the best place to start, is with a story. It's all about storytelling. It's all about writing. So the best way to start is always with a story. You can't go wrong with a story, starting with a story. So I'll just start with a story, because we all love stories. But as writers, we are privileged to enjoy the telling and the reading. That is one privilege we enjoy as writers, the telling and the reading. We must try as much as possible to make it fun also. It's like eating your cake and having it. It makes sense to start with a story. So let me just give you a little story about problem solving. In 2021, 2022, I registered for a postgraduate course in digital humanities. And during the induction, we were asked to say what we would like to take away from the course. Everybody had gone through the curriculum and course objectives and outcome. Many of my classmates were reeling out, diverse objectives. People came from different backgrounds. Some wanted to be librarians, some wanted to be archivists, some wanted to be educators, and so on and so forth. And that is digital humanities for you, because it's from a multidisciplinary approach. It's a course that is anybody can enroll for. So it's not like law or medicine, where you end up as a lawyer or doctor. No. But some of them also wanted to just have a foundation for further studies. Well, in any case, I said that I will hope to apply the knowledge I gained from the course to achieve a long-term ambition of developing an online academy for free and affordable learning. And by then, I had started building this community through our weekly essays. This was in 2022. So, but even at that, I wasn't sure of how the digital academy will materialize. I wasn't clear on how I would apply the knowledge I was about to acquire. But the lecturer assured me that I'll figure it out with time. And I did. The first knowledge I applied was the peer review session we used to replace the system of assessment we had in the first place. Now digital humanities is about application of digital tools and methods, techniques to real life problems. You see, I had a problem. Now pay attention. I had a problem getting the judges to read and assess all the essays, because the entries were increasing. Some of the judges were already tasking me. Some were already demanding recharge card. But it was a problem. So I found a solution in the peer review sessions. When we started the peer review session, we were learning and we were reviewing each other. It was a problem. It was a problem to get the judges to find time to read and assess sometimes 20 stories, sometimes more. We solved that with that peer review session. And during my time in digital humanities, mostly we were learning like this. We were in a classroom, but the lecture was streamed online. Most of our projects were group projects, was collaboration. Just a few you wrote on your own, but each time the lecturer will come, you have done your reading, and he will just introduce the topic, and you start discussing. People will bring ideas, resources, and so on. So I found out that if the era of top to bottom, piling your students with concepts and theories, was over. So my confidence was boosted when we solved this problem, and I said, "Wow," which means this objective can be reached. So here we are now, hosting another cohort for the second time. Last year was so successful. I wasn't involved, but when I read the highlights, I remember calling Daniel and asking him, "How did you put this together?" Because it reminded me of what we did in class. So I said, "No, I will dive in this time, and I'm going to be involved." So here we are again for the second year, and we're hosting this. I'm beginning to feel the academy. That dream is now within reach, and it's all thanks to you, because you keep showing up. You believe in the noble objective. Our journey exemplifies one of my favorite sayings from this writer, Julia Cameron, where she said that as you move towards your dream, the dream will move towards you. I've forgotten the exact words, but that's something like that. As you move towards your dream, the dream will move towards you. So now, let's rewind to today's objective. You're here because you're a budding creative. You want to improve the craft you love. You want to develop confidence in your ability to write, to produce works that will add value. And there's one thing I do. I always qualify the creative with budding, because we're already writing, we're already creating. It's important to know this, because the sessions, the courses we are going to do will be exploratory, expository in a manner that provokes learning via discourse and exchange of ideas and sharing. We're not going to dwell on that is primary. We're not going to dwell on definitions, theories, and classifications. No. We are discussing adults, and what we, the facilitators, will do here is to introduce the topics, the concepts, and the paradigms, and so on and so forth. Then the class will discuss and share ideas, because you already have the resources to read it. And then we'll share more resources and then exchange our opinion, our thoughts, our ideas. And then you do the rest, reading, thinking, and of course, the writing. You do it yourself. Nobody will do it for you. That bit, nobody. What the group does is, like, one, place you in the right environment to deepen your writing practice and get feedback from everyone. Two, will assist you with collaboration and a support network, Then maybe three, provide time and space for you if you have a work in progress, or even to start a project or to develop an idea, will provide the environment for you. And then four, finally, we will try to make it fun, because writers are intelligent and witty people, as I always say. Usually these events like this, I've been to retreats. Retreats like this are held in quiet locations, places that are far detached from the busy life of everyday city life, hustle and bustle. No, you are normally taken to a quiet location. It reminds me of my days in Cardiff when we were to do our research proposal. We were taken to a fairyland in Wales. The place is called Greginog. Very wonderful. It's breathtaking. I'll leave a link in the class notes, so that you can just go and see the place. If you have a look at the place, it's wonderful. So it's a quiet location where we were housed for, I think, 3 nights, and we were able to come up with, each student came up with a thesis proposal. But COVID has come, COVID has ushered in a new normal, and we're able to do this from thousands of miles away, wherever you are, just if you have internet. What does it take to do this? Like I said, the desire to learn, internet access, and your willingness to take part in what we are doing, the daily, the class activities. Things like notebook and even a piece of paper, they are secondary. Because, yeah, it's good to have it, but you don't need to worry much, because there will be show notes, there will be class notes, there will be transcripts, there will be a video too. So our activities will lead to exercises, and then those learning outcomes that you read will be evident in your work. Of course, most people love fiction, while others lean towards non-fiction, but whichever part you choose, I have no doubt that if you keep writing, if you don't stop writing, you will definitely excel. So before I carry on for too long, just participate. Do not hesitate to ask questions. You see a burgeoning creator economy there, where writers have become movie producers, songwriters, authors, multimillionaires. Before, they used to say, Asimov said writing is a lonely job. It's no longer a lonely job. That's why we're here. You can have the support you need. So don't hesitate. Ask questions. The creator economy has no room for backseat people or shy people. Yeah? And before I'll hand over to Daniel, who will take the first week and the second week, I'll just run us through the usual online etiquette. It's not the rule. It's not rules again. It's just etiquette. It's simple. We'll try and leave our camera on and our mic, mute it. We want to see each other. We're not robots. We want to see your smile. And then 2, 1 at a time. Just raise your hand or use the chat box. Don't try as much as possible not to interrupt. And then be respectful. Be respectful. And then try and participate. So thank you so much. And I welcome you to Potent Quill. Daniel, I'll give you the mic now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cmonionline. Just before I continue, can you hear me? Can you?
Of course.
Oh, okay. Okay, fine. So at any point where anyone stops hearing me, please don't hesitate to call my attention. So I would like to welcome each and every one of us here again. It's so good to be doing this again for the second time now. Last year, we did not have the opportunity to have video chats. It was mostly done via WhatsApp and via materials that were sent to the group. But it's good to have this opportunity to see faces, or even though some cameras are turned off, but that's okay. So before I would continue, so this is going to be the very first part of the creative writing discussion that focuses on fiction. So the first week, if you've gone through the schedule, the first week will focus on talking about what a story is, basically what makes up the story. So the different elements, the plot, the structure, the themes, the narrative. So all of that is what we'll try as much as possible to cover within the short period that we have. It's a very expansive field. It's not something that we can exhaust. I can't promise I would exhaust everything, but I will try as much as possible to fit everything within the time frame that we have, right? So before I start my presentation, I'm sorry, but like saying presentation makes it look like I'm some old university professor. So because here in school we use this platform a lot for classes, and oftentimes when my lecturers are present and I'm like, what are these guys doing? Because most of the time, because of the poor network in Nigeria anyways, it's often stressful to learn via platforms like this. So I just hope we don't network doesn't disappoint us. So okay, so I'll be starting my presentation now. I'm so sorry.
Okay, sorry, Daniel, while you're waiting for your presentation to come up, I just want to give us a brief of the structure, Daniel will do his introduction for half an hour. We'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for discussion, 45 minutes. And then we'll take another 10-minute break. And then we'll close with question and answers, which will take 15 to 25 minutes, thereabout. So just to familiarize you with the structure, we'll have 2 breaks, 10 minutes on each side of 30 minutes introduction and 45 minutes of discussion. Thank you, Daniel.
Okay. Thank you very much. So this was just off the pocket, but I don't know why. So the title that what I've titled is Birthing a Masterpiece, the intricacies of short fiction writing. Now, don't quote me anywhere. I'm not an expert myself, and here's the thing, I don't believe anyone is an expert or someone fully learns the art of writing completely, right? So what I believe is that you learn as you go. So it's a never-ending journey. So you discover new tricks and you're like, oh wow, so this is how you can do this. This is how you can implement a new style, a different structure. This is how you can change your structure to fit a different narrative, right? This is how you can impute these things into your story. So that is why I believe that anyone at whatever level of writing that you are capable of writing what I would call a masterpiece. So what I would define as a masterpiece is a story that is relatable, right? Something that people can always remember, something that people will read and it resonates with them, even if it's just one person. So especially when I'm writing my own story, in the first draft, I always ask myself who it is I'm writing for, right? So in the first draft, most of the times I write for just myself. So the story I write in with or whatever I come up with within the first draft is just for myself. But then with the subsequent drafts, I start thinking of who my audience is or who I'm writing for or the kind of people I expect to read my stories, right? So that is what I believe or how I believe you can think along the lines of writing a masterpiece or a short story that people can relate with, right? So to continue, so oftentimes when I talk about writing, I like to begin with definitions. Um, so I like to ask people what they understand a story to be. So Mr. Simoni opened up this cohort by telling a story anyways. So that is what I believe. I believe that what stories are like the bedrocks of all interactions that we have as humans, right? So when I start a conversation about writing with people, I always want to know what people have as an idea of what a story is. And then over the years, there's been so many definitions of what a story is and what happens in a story, what belongs in a story, and what does not belong in a story, right? So people like Randall Gerald has defined a story as a chain of events that begin at one place and ends at another without any essential interruption, right? So that part in quotes is kind of important to me because um, you don't just start off writing a story and about one thing and then you veer off to start talking about another thing, right? So something like talking about or you have a defined plot already and then you now have to veer off to include a different plot, especially in short story writing. Excuse me. Especially with short story writing, right? So it's kind of like an event that is linear, that focuses on something that is particular, something that is just one string of thoughts that is expanded over the period or the length of the story. So also you can define a story as a series of actions and experiences made by characters, real or imaginary, that is grounded in a place. So that is why setting is important in a story. So also you can define a story as a movement, a narrative of a journey undertaken by a character. Well, the obstacles that includes the obstacles they encounter, how they respond to and are affected by these obstacles, and the resultant alteration of the self that happens at the end of this journey. So this is a very important aspect of the definition for me, right? So like you already said, we all know what a story is, right? Everybody here has, at some point in their journey as critics, written a story. So I'm not so particular about what the definitions are. I'm just trying to point out what you should take note of, that I think is vital when we're talking about what a story is. So a story begins is about someone, is about a group of persons, and within that story, you have to showcase what obstacles or what is your character's goal first, and then you'd also have to talk about how does this character want to achieve this goal, and then what are the obstacles that are standing or blocking these characters' ability to achieve this goal, right? That is what we think of, or what you should think of when thinking about what a story is. So the way that the character goes about achieving these goals and what's the obstacles or what the experiences they have in the course of the story has on them. That is essentially what a story is, right? So all around us, all around those stories exist, right? So something that you think is very little, the something that you can obviously ignore, you think, oh, it has no meaning or it doesn't have any value in the grand scheme of things. Like, say you wake up in the morning, you have your bath and you try to go about your day. You get to the bus stop and it's so rowdy, and then everyone around you seems to be hustling to try to get to some place, right? So that is a story existing right before you, right? That is something that is already in motion, right? So it's kind of a movement that it's something that you just cannot explain. It's something that is all around you that exists within that exists within our daily lives, right? So all these idea that everybody you see, it's just like this idea that everybody you see has their own struggles, has their own personal stories going on, right? But then in your head, you're like, oh, this is just my own life happening. But like, you're not just existing in isolation, right? You're existing as a part of a whole. So all around you, everything around you that is happening around you is just a story that is already set in motion. So it depends on you to pick out what part of the story you want to tell or what you want to represent with your ideas. So when writing a story, we also should tend to ask ourselves, what can you see, or how well can you, through words, show what you see to others, right? So it's that ability of conveying what you see to other people. It's something like I always like to use photography as an example, right? So when photographers take pictures of things, it's not as if what they're photographing has never been photographed before. It's not as if they are the first people to handle a camera, or like they are the first person to have photographed a palm tree, or to have photographed a group of birds, or to have photographed people walking around in a park, right? So it's what has always been done, but then what differentiates this particular photograph from another photograph is how they're able to convey, or the emotion that these photographs convey, right? That is why there is perspective before specularity. So anything that you see or any story that you read has already been written before. Anything that you think that you want to write about has already been written before. So there is essentially no new idea that you'd want to create. Like even in the world of science fiction, right? I don't think that there is anything that you want to do with science fiction, or that you any idea that you want to write in science fiction that has not been written before. So it's all about how do you see it? How well are you able to convey what you see to other people? That is what makes your story peculiar. That is what makes your story to stand out from other persons. So Victor Shlovsky said that art makes the familiar things strange so that it can be freshly perceived. Right. So that is essentially what all art does. If you look at um, Van Gogh's paintings, right, that has been going viral for a couple of years now, or I don't know, like several years now. So if you look at Van Gogh's paintings, right, you look at his paintings, and then you look at paintings of perhaps other artists that existed during the same time that he was alive, right? You can't say he was the only person who painted night skies, or who painted flowers, or who painted suburban village scenes, right? But then what makes his own paintings to have this deeply sad sense to it is the colors that he used and the medium that he used, right? So Van Gogh's paintings were, if you see any Van Gogh painting, you can instantly tell that this is Van Gogh's painting, right? So it boils down to the medium he used, um, the intentional choice of colors that he used. So if you look at any of his paintings, they're mostly sprinkled with blues and yellows, right? So all of these signal to you, oh, this is Van Gogh. But then aside that, there is something that he does with lighting that is so spectacular. So instantly when you look at it, there's this kind of forlorn that you feel, this kind of emotion that overcomes you, right? So that is what makes his paintings peculiar. So in the same way, similar way, that is how it is in writing. When you write a story, it is your perspective. What are you bringing new to that narrative? Because all these narratives, like I've already said, already exist, right? So you're not the first person to talk about suicide, you're not the first person to talk about love, you're not the first person to talk about family, or people running away from homes, or people traveling abroad, or people marrying or burying their loved ones, right? So all of these things are already in motion. But then what do you bring that offers a fresh perspective to how people are able to perceive that idea? So I kind of like always try to do a little exercise in between classes, right? But I think we can just look at this, and then during the time for the break, we can talk about it, or we can just within your free time you can just write it, right? So what I usually want you to think about is in terms of how stories are universal, in terms of how you can always bring up ideas from anything, even the most mundane things around you, is to imagine what your day has been like up until this very moment. What details, interesting or uninteresting, comes to your head. Immediately you just close your eyes and think, oh, what have I achieved today, right? What instantly comes to your head? So I'll just like you to, when we go on the 10 minutes break, to like take on this exercise. You forgive my coughing a lot, please. I don't know what happened. So what I would love to talk about next is plot and structure as an element of storytelling. So when we talk about plot, We're talking about a series of events that occur within a story. So this happened now, this happened yesterday, this will happen tomorrow, right? So this is plot. You wake up in the morning, you do this, you do that, you will do this tomorrow, you will do this after. That is the plot of your day, right? We often tend to plan our lives 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead. Where do you see yourself from in 10 years' time? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time, right? So we have these ideas of how our lives are going to span out in years, right? So that is a plot, that is you laying down what the plot of your life looks like or should look like. So Aristotle defines plot as a series of events that is accompanied by a change. And the last word is very important, change. So by the end of each story that you've read or each story that you've written or you're about to write, you often discover that what people started out with or what a character started out with at the very beginning of that story is not how they ended up, right? So I've already talked about goal, giving your characters goals in a story. So you find out that from the very first beginning of the story till the end, after they've traversed through whatever obstacles that they've passed through, you find out that there is a change that has occurred in them by the end of that story, right? So it's an obvious example is that is I'm assuming that all of us here read the schedule, the materials for this class. So in Raymond Carver's A Small Good Thing, which is a story that I love so much, right? In Raymond Carver's A Small Good Thing, we see Scotty's mom at the very beginning of the story. So the story opens with her the at the bakery, right? So I'm going to be referring to this story or the stories that we've read. I'm going to be referring to these stories in the course of this interaction. So we see Scotty's mom at the beginning. She's at the bakery. She wants to get a cake for her son's birthday, right? So, but then that is the goal she starts out with at the beginning of the story. But then that is not what she ends with at the like when you read through all of that events that has happened with the story. The point where they end is not the same point where they started, right? So it's some kind of like an energy has shifted. It's obvious that something has happened to them, and then how are they able to adapt to this change, right? So you see them adapting to the new reality of what their lives has become at the point where the story comes to an end, right? So plot is all about the overall happenings in the story, including the order in which they occur, how they relate to each other, and the impact they have on your characters. Right? So exciting ideas, you can have exciting ideas, you can have well-drawn characters, you can have an interesting setting. But then all of these things come alive when you've passed them through the forms of a well-structured plot arc. What do I mean by this? When you've when you have a story that is set in whatever place it is set in, when you have a story that has this interesting three-dimensional characters that are moving through the world, right? All of these are very good. But then at the end of the story, what people look at is, oh, this happened because this happened, right? So they're able to draw links between the way your story flows. So it's just like water, right? It just flows uninterrupted, right? So it's just how you're able to link the events in your story from one point to another, from point A to point B to point C to the end of the story, right? So you're linking it with what links them is these events that you describe, how they are related to each other, what you put your character through, how they're able to jump over whatever you've put them through, right? So oftentimes it is what remains after a reader has put down the story. So if your character does not pass through any obstacle, if your character does not change by the end of the story, then you don't essentially have a story. So the work of creative writing or the work of fiction writing is asking yourself questions at each moment in time, at each point you arrive, and you ask yourself, how do I make this story come more alive? How do I make this character resonate more with people? Right. So characters have their motivations at the beginning of the story, and then as the story progresses, now talk about the conflicts and the obstacles, and then they have to confront those obstacles eventually. Then what decision do they make in the end? So plot is sort of an interruption, an interruption to the set goals of your character. Like I've already said, that we plan our lives 10 years from now, 5 years from now, but then we don't put into account extraneous material that may come in to like alter whatever we've planned that will happen. We don't take into fact the uncertainties that we might lose the support system we have at this point, or we might lose a loved one, or we might even die in the process of chasing this goal, right? So all of that is what accounts for the plot of your story. So up to this point, am I still making sense, or have I been talking to myself all this while? I don't like listening to the sound of my own voice for a very long time, so I would like to get feedback from time to time, please.
You're doing great.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So to continue, we'll talk about plot components, right? So I've already talked about how the concept of plot and structure raises questions, or a set of questions that guides you through the writing of your story, right? So the other question that is also important for you to ask yourself is how much can you fit in a story, or how much should you fit in a story? So at this point in time, I am kind of in a dilemma. So I wrote a story that spanned for like 6,000 up to 7,000 words, right? And I don't usually write when I write stories that exceed 5,000 words. So the dilemma I'm having is trying to cut down the story, to remove some parts of the story, some bits of the stories, to like so that it can still retain the strength that it has. But then as I've gone through rounds of edits and I'm reading the story over and over again, I discover that a lot of the things that I've written, or a lot of the information that I've put into the story, kind of hold the story together. So I'm now at this quagmire where I don't know what to remove or what to leave. People say, famous writers would say, kill your darlings, right? So remove the things that you love the most and then see if it stands, right? So I'm kind of skeptical about doing that. So I'm kind of skeptical about doing that with any of my work, because I don't know. I've not yet arrived to the point where I feel like if I remove this part of the story, it still retains the same amount of strength that it had as I'd imagined it before, right? But then the point of this is that as you write a story, there are things that you should not, or maybe you wouldn't know as you're writing the first draft, right? But then there are things that are not necessary to move your story forward, right? So when you're writing a story, you're thinking in terms of, okay, this has happened, right? How do I, when you're trying to, it's just the questions that I've talked about. How can you make this story to be more compact, right? What do I remove? What do I take out that does not serve this story, that does not serve this story better, or does not serve this story well? So all of these are the questions that you'd have to ask yourself when writing a story. So when we also talk about cause and effect, so the actions in your story should always have a reason they happen. Nothing should ever occur in isolation, right? So this has to happen. But that's also why when I talk about plot, or when I see people talk about plot, there is always this sense of interconnectedness that exists between the ideas. You have to move from point A to point B, and then it's just like a linking word. So A happens, then B happens. It's not necessarily like that. It's A happens or B happens because A has happened, or A will happen and then B will happen. So it's just kind of that flow between the events that occur in the story. So there has to be kind of a cause and effect. So this happened, and then as a result of this is happening now. So what are the types of plots that we have? So in the previous um, in the previous cohort, that was last year, we talk about different kinds of plots, but like I don't expect that I will be repeating all those kinds of plots, because essentially I believe that whatever you are writing falls under most of these kinds of plots. Like, so we have an episodic plot, a linear plot. And a clear example of an episodic plot is if you've seen the Game of Thrones series, right? So if you've seen the Game of Thrones series, it's a good example of what an episodic plot is. But then a linear plot is just, oh, it just follows one particular idea from the beginning to the end of that particular story. So these are the kinds. There are several kinds of plots. Like I said, I'm not here to talk about definitions or to give to give basic ideas, because I believe you already know most of these things. But then what I would want to categorically talk about is plot devices. So when we're talking about plot devices, there are a lot of them. There are things that are important to advance your plot. There are things that are necessary that you need to move your story forward. For an example of that is flashback, right? So if you read, I can't think of any. So in Symbols and Signs, in Vladimir Nabokov's Symbols and Signs, right? So we see when the parents have returned. I'm assuming we've read the story. Sorry. That's at this point I have to ask. Did all of us here read the story? You can unmute yourself to respond if you read the story. Or
Which story are you
yes,
talking about? No.
Symbols
Sorry.
and Signs. Vladimir Nabokov's Symbols and Signs.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah.
So that's good. I don't know about other persons. This one that nobody has said any other thing.
Collins.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. So if in case if you've not read the story, I would advise that you
You're
go
doing
back
well.
after. I'd advise that you go back after now to read the story, right? To read the stories. There are like 3 stories in week 1 and 3 in the second week. So in Symbols and Signs, right? So I'm talking about an example of a flashback. In Symbols and Signs, after the parents had returned from the sanitarium, that's the mental institute where their son is hosted. Um, there is some kind of interaction that happens, and then the mom goes back in memory. It's not clear. It's not explicit that it doesn't state that, oh, this is flashback. It's just this subtle change in narrative that occurs, where we get to see how the child got to the point where he was, or how he arrived to be at the sanitarium. So we get to see that the child wasn't always did not always live or stay at the sanitarium. He grew up as a normal child, like every other child did, and then up until the point where they started noticing changes in patterns and started to understand what the illness of the child was, right? So that is an example of flashback, right? So the other plot device that I think is also important is foreshadowing. So foreshadowing is when you bring in you kind of open so foreshadowing is kind of when you don't explicitly give every information to the reader, right? But it's kind of like an introduction, or kind of like something that you refer to in passing, and then it just gets to the point later on in the story where that thing happens, right? So kind of like an event that has not yet occurred, but eventually it will occur. But then you start hinting at it at the very beginning of the story, or somewhere at the beginning of the story. That is where you hint at that kind of event. And then when it eventually happens, it just creates this element of surprise in storytelling. So the third one that I'll talk about is cliffhangers. So stories like Chimamanda Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun end in cliffhanger. Half of Unison ended with a cliffhanger. We kind of, so each year people will go on social media to ask, oh, Chimamanda Adichie, but where is Kainene? When is she coming back? Right? When are we getting an answer to where she went to, right? But so that kind of has created this conversation, right? So every year, even people that have not read the story, but then when people talk about Kainene, it just triggers this it just triggers this curiosity in other people who have not read the story to go and read it to find out what exactly the story is about, right? So that is what cliffhangers are about. So in sorry. So in red herrings, right? A red herring is, I think I've seen most of it occur in movies than I've seen or than I've read in fiction. But a red herring is when you try to consider, or when you try to trick your readers that the bad guy is actually the good guy. So people who use red herrings most often are people who write thrillers, who write thriller fictions, right? So they kind of try to hide something evil, something sinister in plain sight, right? So that you don't realize that this is happening, and then when it's finally exposed, it just kind of blows your mind. So it's also part of the things that we talk about when you're talking about creating an element of surprise in your stories. So people define, sometimes people often define the sequence in a story as beginning, a middle, and a twist, right? So it's that twist that creates an element of surprise. So because of time, I don't know if I'll talk about all the other ones, but so Chekhov's gun, um, named after the famous writer Anton Chekhov. Anton Chekhov says if you introduce a gun, or if you write, um, if you, when describing a scene at the beginning of your story and you introduce a gun at the beginning of the story, then somewhere in between that story, you must have to use that gun. That is how the name Chekhov's gun came about. So an example of this is an example of this is Adichie's, although it happened immediately, right? Adichie's Adichie's purple hibiscus also, when Papa flung the missile at at his son, and then it shattered the furniture that was standing on the other side of the room, right? So that is a kind of a plot device, right? So there are other instances where you've seen something introduced in the beginning of a story, and then you later find out why they are always hinting at it, why it always had to maintain center stage, right? So whenever you're writing a story, you always have to ask, does this thing I'm introducing now, does it have any need, or will it have any need in in the coming scenes, in the coming sequences that will follow? So if the answer to that question is no, then that thing does not belong in that story, or that element or that object does not belong in that story. Like, words are important. So you don't have to introduce words or introduce things that you don't have a need for, or that are just there just to beautify or take up space, right? So you must have to be intentional about what you introduce in your story and then what you leave out of your story. So plot devices are what pick up a reader's interest very early in the story. So it's what draws them in. Whatever happens from there determines whether they will stay for the remaining acts, or if they will just leave your story and go. So in Jared Lemus's Saint Dismas, for example, so the author opens up with a bit of an action where we see the children, or well, they are teenagers. So we see them doing an action, right? So we see them standing along the road. So that immediately tells us um, what kind of people we are meeting. So that piece of introduction, you just already know that, oh, these people can't be people who are from an affluent part of society or people who have sufficient parental guidance, right? So it just throws us into that action, introduces us to the characters, and then we're able to tell, oh, this is the kind of people you're going to meet in this story. And that immediately piques your interest to find out more about these children, right? So Jared Lemus created this element of curiosity throughout Saint Dismas. Right. So when he started talking about how the children or the teenagers had to sleep in tents or in taps in the forest, and how they were always attacked by mosquitoes, and how the protagonist always dreamt of home, right? So it already tells you what these characters want out of life, why they are doing whatever it is they're doing at that point in time. But then, aside from that, aside from having told you why they are doing this, the element of curiosity that it creates in you is that you want to find out why they are not at home or why they don't have their parents with them, for example, right? So you start wondering, oh, how did they arrive here? How did they become who they are at this point in time, right? So, and then throughout the period of your reading, you just want to find out what happens. That is what drives you to read on until you get the answer of how they got to the point where they are, how their villages were raided, and how they were paid to vacate, where the families were paid to vacate, where they lived, and how the people who did not accept the payments were exterminated, sort of. So that is the curiosity that Jared Lemus creates with a story. I've already talked about Raymond Carver's A Small Good Thing, and how he opened up with an action. So up until this point, I've talked about how um, plot and how your plot, your structure is supposed to move, and the devices are supposed to move your stories forward, right? So when you read the first sentence of cover story, the next question you ask yourself is why? Why is she here, right? And then you find out why, you find out what happened, and like all of that sequence just that I've already talked about before, all of that just kind of explains what happened in the story. So when I finished reading Covers A Small Good Thing and Jared Lemus's Saint Dismas, right? There was this striking similarity that I found in both stories. So I don't know if someone also had the same epiphany as I did. I would want to ask um, anyone here who read the story if they noticed or if they observed anything, it's anything similar between Carver's story and Jared's story.
Frankly, I didn't read those two. I was too fascinated by this Nabokov story.
Oh, okay, okay. So I'd actually not want to give away the answer, but so one thing I found striking about both stories, which kind of was obvious, was that they sort of ended at the point where they started, right? So cover story began in a baker's shop and then ended in a baker's shop, right? So it's all that circle. So it circled back to the point where it 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 began. So Emmanuel, you're raising your hand.
Okay, so it's like a story that begins at and then continues until it gets back to that particular point. Yes.
Exactly. So cover story began, like I already said, began in the baker's shop and then ended in the baker's shop. And then Jared's story began on the road and then ended with the teenagers yet still on the road, right? But then what is different in even in the sense that they both began and ended in the same location, what is different is that at the point where they returned to the place where they began, something had already occurred in them. A sort of change had already happened in them. So they're not the same person they were when the story began. That is what is very, very important in the way the stories progress. So all through the story, they pass through this series of changes to get to the point where they come back to the very first place they started, and then they come back with a different realization that they are not the same kind of person that they were. So I've partly talked about structure, how it is the framework that guides how your actions and sequences are laid down. And I've talked about the three act structure, which is a setup, a confrontation, and the resolution, right? So how a setup establishes a status quo, and the middle introduces a conflict and resulting confrontations, and all of them are summarized by a resolution that proves satisfying. So something I also like to talk about when I talk about structure is the Freytag's pyramid. So whenever you're writing a story, you always have to think about it in terms of these seven parameters, right? So your story has to have an exposition, which is a background information on characters and setting, and it has to have an inciting incident, which is what sparks the action in the story and what what triggers the rest of your protagonist's journey. So from the exposition, we have an inciting incident, and then we have the rising action, which are major events that add suspense or tension to a plot. Then we have the climax, which is the turning point in the story. So things most of us here have not read cover story particularly. I would want you to go back after the class to read cover as a small good thing and then pinpoint the parts of this pyramid that you notice in the story. So from the climax, you have the falling action, which are few events that bring into perspective the conflict that the characters have faced and also broadens their understanding of it. And then after the falling action, you have the resolution, which is where you you have your characters examine or re-examine what they've gone through, and then the denouement, which is where you tie up the loose end. Right? So all of these things do not have to follow this particular structure, but then what is important is that it must contain these elements, right? So it must contain these elements. The exposition can come even after you've introduced your major conflict, right? But then we have to know who your character is. We have to know what they do, what they think of the world around them. So that is very vital, because if you give us a character that we don't know, it is difficult for us to be able to root for that character. So people read stories where they see characters that they can root for, read stories for to see characters that look like them or that resonates with them, right? So that is why why it's important that you must always give an exposition on what your characters are and or who they are. So I can't read all of this. Maybe perhaps when I share the document, you can go through it again. We're already running behind time. So we're almost through with this. I don't know if so at this point, does anybody have any question? Even if it's something that I've talked about early on that you want to draw my attention to that was not clear initially.
No, I just want to talk about this these signs and symbols. Can you hear me? I don't know if my
Yes, sure, I can.
yeah. Which is quite intriguing. I had to Google the writer. Why the character is a notable writer, and I just want to talk about how he started. Just the visit to the sanatorium where the couple was informed, the elderly couple were informed that their child almost committed suicide, and it will disturb him. Their visit will disturb him, and then they started going back. It was just a brief intro, and then the going back was where the flashback started. Not the flashback, kind of reflection started. So it is intriguing how he was able to briefly just introduce these two characters, tell about their environment, and then with the reflection, continued the exposition on their history, their background, and telling us even that, like you said, that their son wasn't like that always. He once led a normal life with, so at the end of the writing, at the end of the story, we still did not have a name for the main characters, the man and the wife. I don't know what you make of that. It's a magical writing for me. I don't know how these guys are able to do this.
Yes, we did not have a name,
creative writing,
we are still
fiction.
able to.
No name, but we knew all about them, that they were
Exactly.
Russian Jews or something. They migrated from, I think, Berlin or so. So many details, and we're still not giving a name. I don't know how. It's not easy. Sometimes I say non-fiction is more difficult because of the fact that you have to do some research. You're trying to, stick to the facts as much as you can, even when you're doing creative non-fiction. But I mean, the imagination that runs through these guys, I wonder at times. What did you make of it?
A writer I love so much said that if there is anything godlike about God, it is that he dared to imagine. So he said, I can't, I'm paraphrasing the quote, but it says, imagination is the voice of daring. So, and that is what I always tell people. You can never run out of stories, right? When people say that they have writer's block, it sounds so out of place to me, because there is no way you can have writer's block, right? So there are rare cases when you don't have the motivation to write, but then the stories are always there. You just have to imagine. So imagination is universal to everybody, right? So you just, also what I loved about signs and symbols is how all of that, we never got a name, but then we had this emotion, right? Nabokov was able to inspire this sort of visceral reaction on the readers through his stories. That is what I want to point out something here. I'm not reading the whole quote, just the whole. I'm not reading the whole paragraph, just the part that says what makes those situations riveting. That is the event that has happened in your story. What makes those situations riveting is the internal effect they are having on someone we care about, right? So why people care about your stories, it's not because of the beautiful scenery that you've painted. It's not because of the names of your characters, whatever particular names you've given your characters, right? It's because of where you've positioned them, how they react to where you've positioned them, and then what kind of reaction do they express to that point or that location where they are, right? So one of the brilliant things that Nabokov did with signs or symbols and signs is also where, and which is also what I will talk about in Voice. But I think since I'm kind of modeling everything up. I should just talk about it now. Is how he brilliantly shifts movement from one narrative to the other, right? So we see the story begin with in the sensibilities of the wife, right? So we see most of the story happen from the wife's perspective. That's correct. But then as the story progressed to the point where they had to leave each other at the sanitarium, right? That point, the story switches and then goes to the husband's perspective, right? So just like this synchrony between the characters, the synchronicity between the voices, it's something akin to relay race runners, right? So you see how smooth they are when they pass the baton from one athlete to the other, and then the next has to carry on the story, or the next has to carry on the race, right? So Nabokov did that very brilliantly. Um, he's a master of storytelling, and he it kind of you just know instantly that there's been a shift in movement in this story. You just notice, oh, this has shifted from this character's perspective to this other character's perspective, and then you want to experience the stories from, and you begin experiencing the story from the point of view of the husband, to the point where he's at the staircase of their house and he realizes that, oh, he doesn't have the key to their home, right? That is something that is very um, something that is very simplistic, right? But then what makes it different is that it's something that almost everybody relates with. So I can relate with having forgotten to collect my key from someone, from my roommate or a friend or a family relative, right? Something that is very universal. And it's because of that, that is why people are able to relate with your story better. So if you include things that are relative, that people experience in their everyday lives, it's not mundane, right? Like I said at the very beginning, that art is kind of an attempt at defamiliarization. Like you're trying to make something that is almost commonplace to look new through perspective. So another writer that does this, another writer who does this very well is John Paul Lahiri. I think her story is in the second book, Sexy. So Jumpo Lahiri is, and if you've not read any of our works, I would recommend you start by reading Sexy. And she has a couple of other books that you can find online. The most recent I read was Romance Stories. So in Romance Stories, the stories in the book were um, about people who lived in Rome who did everyday things, like very simplistic things, right? But then with the way she told the stories, with the elements that she used to talk about her characters, it was just all too fascinating. That is what makes readers to care about your stories. So I can finish reading a book now, and I don't remember anything that has happened in I don't remember the characters' names or the particular events or where they took place. But then what stays with me is what this story made me feel. That is very important in our story. That brings me to talk about language and style. Right. So in language, you're thinking about how is the story conveyed, what are the specific word choices, right? So style highlights a story's significance within a particular medium. So it's what conveys the mood, sets the focus, propels the image, and strengthens the meaning of your story. Sorry. So when you're writing a story about, say, a 5-year-old, for example, there are words that, or there are vocabularies that are particular to children of at the age of 5. You don't expect a child who is 5 to be using verbose language. You don't expect a child who is 5 to be using um, concrete or languages you consider well read or pretty much very learned, right? So there has to be a distinction in the voice or in the language of just based on who your protagonist is or who your characters are. So an example I like to use is an example I like to use when I'm talking about language and style is Daniel Case's Flowers for Algernon. So I, I I'd wanted to include the story, but I don't know, it just kind of skipped my mind, and I think I'll just have to send it to the group since most of us are on the WhatsApp group. I think I'll just have to send it to the group. So in Flowers for Algernon, um, our character is a dullard. The protagonist is an uneducated person. So it's kind of science fiction. They're trying to make the protagonist intelligent. It's kind of an experiment, right? So without giving away too much, we just see how in the language, in the story, how language shows progressions on when the experiment is working and when their experiment is failing, on what kind of language this individual used before this experiment started, and what kind of language he was using at the point where the experiment was going on, and then what kind of like it just shows that. So another example is from a book I've not yet read completely, from Abidare's The Girl with the Louding Voice. So it sparked a conversation recently. I think I saw a conversation about it 2 days ago on Twitter, where someone was saying that they loved how she used, because her character was a slightly educated woman, and then the English she used was not was kind of uneducated English. So you now have to ask yourself what exactly is uneducated English, right? But then you read it and then you understand instantly, oh, this character does not have adequate adequate learning, or you can immediately tell that they don't have the facilities, or they don't have the ability to have pursued a higher level of education, right? So that is what language talks about. That is what language in your story is about. So when we talk about style, we're talking about what is the outlook of your story, right? So some people who write prose, people who write fiction, I would use Toni Morrison as an example. So Toni Morrison's language was a bit, or let me not use Toni Morrison, let me use a writer who is familiar with all of us. Shoinka, for example, right? Shoinka's language is a bit dense, is what you call dense. It's not something that is immediately understood by, you have to have this ability. Shoinka's writing is difficult for me to read at some point, which is why for some of his books that I've read, I kind of did not finish some of them, right? Because of the writing, how it was kind of, you have to belong to a group of intellectuals to be able to read Schwenker's writing. So that is his style, right? And if you look all through his books, the style has always remained. So everybody knows that Shorinka is something you may want to call a difficult to read writer. So everybody who's read Shorinka agrees on the fact that his language is quite verbose, or not verbose. That his language is quite dense, right? So it's not something that everybody can immediately understand. But then that is a style. There are people who write fiction as if they're writing poetry. Right? Someone like Toni Morrison, for example. And then some of several writers that I've read write fiction with elements of poetry. So they try to include verse, try to include something that you wouldn't immediately call and what a normal narrative in fiction is, or what you wouldn't say this is what what literary fiction looks like. Right. So that is why even in fiction there is a lot of categories. There's a literary, there's science fiction, there is fantasy, and then all of these are based on the different styles that these writers use, and then what they incorporate into the stories that they tell. So essentially, with language and style, you have to make sure that whatever language you're using, whatever style you're using, is relevant to your story. If it is not relevant, then it should not be in your story. If you try this style and it doesn't work out for you, then you can try another style. That is one thing about fiction. You have this very wide landscape. There is nobody restricting you from doing anything, right? There are rules about writing in fiction. There are rules, but then I always have this notion that the reason why these rules exist is because it's so you can break them, right? So you have to know the rules for you to be able to break them. So there is no one size fits all style or language for writing. So you can do whatever you want. You can write an entire story in pidgin. That is left for you to do because Juno Diaz writes stories with that includes his native language, and then everybody, the world is fine. Nobody has gone crazy. I mean, after all, it is the people who get it get it. The people who don't, right? So also the conversation that I saw recently on Twitter is whether you should whether you should explain foreign languages or local languages when they are used in fiction. Like say I'm an Igbo person and I write a sentence in Igbo because my character is Igbo. Do I necessarily have to explain that sentence within the body of the story? So some people say that it's often distracting. There is Google for everything. Quite all right. And then some of the notion that, oh, you can add footnotes because it's sometimes obstructive to the flow of imagination of the readers, right? But then to kind of say where I am, I'm kind of in the middle in this conversation. This is a personal opinion. I'm kind of in the middle. And I'm in the middle because I've seen it used and I've seen it work. So Adichie uses Igbo in her writing, but then she doesn't explicitly say what the meaning of that sentence is. But then what precedes would like give you an idea of what the characters were talking about, right? So if you want to find out what exactly the sentence says, you'd have to do the work to find out what that sentence is about. Then that does not stop you from using your local language in fiction or using pidgin in fiction, right? So you can use whatever style you want, whatever language that you want, as long as it serves the purpose of the story. So when we talk about thematic focus, we're talking about what the message of your story is about. So what do you want to explore, or what is the overall general idea that you want your story to be about? Like I said at the very beginning, that there is nothing new that you want to write about that has not been written before, right? Grief, sadness, love, suicide, gender-based violence, feminism, whatever it is you want to write about has already been written. Right? So what differentiates you from all the other writers who have written on these themes is what do you bring, or what what perspective do you have that other people do not have, right? So what a theme is, it's the underlying message that is imparted through a work of literature. So it's often seen as the central idea relating to the story. So the themes of stories reach beyond the plots, it reach beyond the characters. It's a message that readers can take into their own personal life, right? So just to deviate, right? I, I'm the type of person that judge people by the kind of books that they read. I'm not sorry to say it. So I'm someone who enjoys reading fiction so much, and a bulk of my life is inspired by fiction to the point where I don't know if fiction is real and then real life is fiction, right? But then all of these things are interconnected, right? So fiction inspires life, life mirrors fiction, all of that, right? So most of the lessons that I've learned about life, principles that I run with, or attitudes that I've learned, empathy, um, being being rational, checking up on people, reaching out to people to know like when they need my help or when to like just the basic idea of understanding what the general human condition is about. All of that I've learned through fiction. And then it is something that I've learned, that a skill that I don't think any other kind of work has influenced me. And this is not to say the other other writings or other genres of writing do not have their own lessons, right? But I will state categorically that I don't rate people who read self-help books, right? So I'm sorry if anybody feels like that, but this is a personal opinion. So I don't rate people who read self-help because I don't know if it's kind of like you are not curious enough to find out what um, what is happening outside of, like, just on a broader view, right? So what self-help books do, at least the ones that I've read, at least the ones that I finished reading, what I've noticed is that they are mostly a rehashing of someone's personal experiences, right? So it's kind of like an indoctrination telling you how you should do things. It doesn't give you the avenue for you to be able to explore life on by yourself or on your own. But then this is something that I found that fiction does very important. So this brings me back to talking about themes, right? So most of the themes that or any kind of thing you want to explore in your writing, it's just something that you have to think about. How are you going to explore this theme? How are you going to make it to how are you going to make it to inspire more people to, like, think in this direction, right? It's not an extension of of who you are as a person, in as much as you are the person telling the story. But then one thing about creative writing, or one thing about fiction writing, if you've always noticed, is that when you start out the story, right, you might not necessarily know what you want to write about. But then as a story continues, you find, oh, this is what the story wants me to do. This is what the story wants me to, like, all of that is not your of your own doing. That is the characters communicating through perhaps everything that you've experienced or things that you've processed throughout your daily living. And then all of that is merging together to bring out this particular kind of experience. So fiction is sort of an examination of sorts, right? It's where you can come to examine ideas, but not necessarily want to impose it on people to think in this one direction. So that is why I think fiction most importantly forces people to think for themselves, right? It forces you to not necessarily choose a side, but to understand that there is no rigid side to things. It just gives you the perspective to see things from different points of views, and you can understand, oh, this is why this is happening. This is why this is not happening, right? So all of that is why I think it is important when you're writing to focus on one general idea that you want to pass in through your writing. So, so it's something that I put down here. It's when you're talking about themes in terms of writing creative fiction. You're not talking about just singular abstractions like love or empathy or hatred, right? It's that abstraction plus something else. It's like grief plus a way to navigate it. It's like love plus the worth of holding on to it, right? Life plus the beauty of always looking around for pockets of happiness. So that is what theme is about in creative fiction writing. So So we're almost through with this session, and then I'm so sorry that we did not have the break, but we'll try to incorporate that in the next session. So when we're talking about narrative voice and POV, I think I've already talked about that when I was explaining Nabokov's symbols and signs of what perspective stories are told from. So you have to ask yourself, who is your protagonist for you to be able to choose a particular narrative and POV for that story, right? So it's very important to carefully choose a particular narrative voice because this can have a lasting effect on the story and how readers respond to the event that is happening. So a narrative's POV allows the reader to view everything through the stance of the characters, including their emotions and experiences. So it determines whether the readers are able to root for your characters or if they instantly dislike them. So Game of Thrones, for example, again, when I think about writing that is excellently done, my my examples tend to tilt toward movies and novels or short stories that I've read, but mostly movies. So Game of Thrones is a perfect example, right? So if you've seen Game of Thrones, you'd notice instantly that you immediately see Joffrey Baratheon and you instantly hate him just from the very first interaction or the very first scene where you see him. You instantly dislike him, right? So that is what kind of an example of what narrative and POV is about, right? What the characters embody. So how the characters are able to embody the story. So if you say you want to write a story in the first person POV, right? So it shows the readers the inside mind of it shows the story is the inside mind of the reader, right? So it helps people to follow and better understand what this character is thinking about, right? So types of narrative voices are all outlined here. So the first person, singular, plural. Second person, where you're talking about when you're employing somehow you're employing the reader as a protagonist, where you're referring to in the you voice, right? But then also, it's not always quite employing the reader, which is what most people get wrong, right? So most times when people read stories that are written in the second person, they think that you're the person that the reader is the person that is being directed at, right? But it's not necessarily so. Sometimes it may be someone else, a character referring to someone else. Right? Maybe one fictional character addressing another fictional character. And an example of this story is Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, right? So in Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, it's a very short story. I think I'll have to find it and then I'll send it across to the group chat. So we talk about the third person limited, third person multiple, third person omniscient. Like I've already said in symbols and signs, and in Raymond covers a small good thing. So these are all stories that are told in the third person narrative, right? In Jared Lemos's story, it's told in the first person, I think, and then the first person is able to show us of what the narrator is thinking about, and also in extension with what the people he's surrounded by are also thinking about, or the actions that he carry out, and how those actions affect him and affect the rest of the group. So there is no particular POV that is best for a narrative, right? The ultimate choice depends on what serves the story's function the best. What are the intentions of your story? You have to examine the limitations that exist with each perspective, and then go with the voice that feels most natural to your character. So what I do most times when I start out writing a story is I may begin writing this particular story in the first person um, POV, and and then in the middle of the story, I discover that it doesn't allow me to explore certain things that I would want to explore. Maybe I would want to bring in someone else's experience, or I want to introduce another character and not just make them a sketch, right? I want to make them part and parcel of the story. And then I find out that the first person point of view does not work essentially well for me. What I do is I copy the story. That is, I have different documents for one particular story where I test out each point of view, right? So I start a story in the first person, and then I copy the story, go to another document, and then start that same story in the third person, just to know what it reads like, or if I'm able to find more balance, more wiggle room to be able to explore what I want to explore in the story. And if I don't find it in the third person, I switch immediately to the second person point of view. Like it's just all these experiments until you arrive at a voice that feels true to your cause, a voice that best explores what you want to talk about. But that is why it's very important for you to think about carefully what narrative voice or what POV you want to write your story from. So the final thing that I would want to talk about is interiority in fiction. So the best works of fiction lend us an invitation into the lives and experiences of their characters. It's quite like watching a play at a theater, except it's even more intimate. That's because there is something happening within this particular story, within the mind of a particular character, that is private to only the reader and the character in focus. So when you read a story, you're introduced to a particular character. There are things that or emotions that the character has that um, becomes immediately affectative to you, right? You just instantly start feeling for this character. You have empathy, or you can relate to the cause that this character is pursuing, right? So that is what interiority is about. It's how we are able to, how people are able to, how readers are able to see your characters more than just physical appearance, right? How they're able to see what goes on inside of their head, what they are thinking about, what actions they want to take, and then the different decisions that they make. So another example that I would want to, or something that I would want to talk about that is an offshoot of interiority is subtext. So what best explains, I think subtext would best fit in when we're talking about dialogue, right? So I think I'll just leave it at that for now. But then when you're talking about interiority in fiction writing, what you always want to think about is that people don't always say what they think about, right? Even as human beings, we don't always say what we are thinking in a conversation, for example, or in a public sphere, in a public meeting, for example, we might have something on our mind in a conversation. But then that is not what we say out loud, right? For example, you may be having a conversation or an argument with someone, and then you don't agree, you don't quite agree with the person. But then because you don't want the person to feel slighted by your own opinions, you just have to keep that thought to yourself. That is what interiority is about. So the readers are able to see that, oh, this character is not saying what is in his head, right? So he's saying something else outside of what he's thinking, right? Just because he can maintain, just because he wants to maintain this particular relationship with the people that he is with. Right? That is what interiority is about. When interiority is just like the world outside of the character's head, it doesn't have access to these thoughts, right? It doesn't have access to the character's emotions, their fears, their skepticisms. And that's what offers readers the ability to view the world through someone else's lens, to sort of like wear their skin, even if for a brief moment. It's just when someone tells you to um, imagine yourself in their shoes, sort of. So that's like that's a phrase that best explains what interiority is like. So you see someone outside, they are just looking all right, going about their day, but then you don't know what they're passing through until they tell you about it, right? That is how you are able to relate with them. You're able to come down to the level where they are and say, "Oh, I see what you see now. I see what you're experiencing now." Right? That is what interiority is all about. So interiority answers the why of a character's reactions, and that brings about depth. So one thing you always have to work on when writing is to make sure that your characters are not just people who are cardboard cutouts, right? So your characters have to have contradictions in themselves. Right? They have to have some things that they do when they are happy, when they are anxious, when they are sad, right? That is what brings about depth in your character. That is what makes people to relate with them the more. So interiority offers first-hand access into the psyche of fictional characters as they process events. It's what affects readers long after they've read a story. It creates a sort of resonance, and that is what vehicles readers through your story. So they may not remember names, like I've already said, places, particular details of events, but then readers remember what the story made them feel. That is what always stands out. I think this is the last slide, and um, I thank each and every one of you for being here. So now I'll open the floor for questions or for comments for the people who joined us in the middle of the class. You're all welcome. So I'll open the open the floor now for questions. If you have any question, you can raise your hand or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Thank you very much. Oh, all right, Emmanuel, you can go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for a lot of things. But I wanted asking, at what point is it necessary to tell a little in your fiction? Do you mean that everything you write has to be shown? Because if everything has to be shown, then I think it's going to be a lot of words describing, a lot of adjectives and all that. How do you balance showing and telling in order to give off a very beautiful work, a very beautiful fiction work?
Okay, so I guess we're asking is the common advice of show, don't tell, right? So that's a good question, and that's an advice that is prevalent, that is prevailed for the longest of time in fiction, right? When you tell people to show and don't tell, I think there's a balance that exists between both. There are places in your story where you would need to tell, right? And there are places in your story where you need to show us an action, right? So you don't necessarily, an example of showing is you don't say Daniel was angry and then he left the room, right? So something like you show us the actions that showed that he is angry, right? Like you said, he dragged his legs on the floor and then he banged the door as he left. That shows emotion, right? And that emotion is anger. But then there are other times where you need to tell, right? At the point where you're describing an event or a setting or a room, right? It's also telling. So there is an interconnection between the both of them. There's a balance between there's a balance between showing and telling. So it's just like so last 2 years ago, I guess, in Meron Hadero's short story that was shortlisted for the King Prize, The Street Sweep. Sorry, I'm sorry if I'm talking about a lot of abstract stuff when I'm talking about that. It's just important that I use examples from stories that have been written by writers to explain what I'm talking about. Right? So Meron Hadro opens her story with an image of a character struggling to perfect how to knot a tie. So we know immediately that he has never had a need to wear a tie in a long while. So that is an example of showing, right? So you don't need to tell us, oh, that your character has never worn a tie before, right? It's that particular action that she describes that tells us, oh, that makes us realize, oh, at this point, this character has never used a tie before. But then other things that are expository, you can't just use showing to write all of your story. There has to be a bit of telling, right? There has to be somewhere where you need to quicken the story, where you need to quicken the plot of the story, or the narrative of the story, right? And that is where things like dialogue come in, right? So when there are several proposals of that a dialogue serves, which I'm supposed to be talking about next week, but then I think it's relevant that we talk about it now. So when you are telling us that through conversation, right, that these characters had this, and this had happened to them, right? So the dialogue that happens between two characters, for example, is telling us that this is why this has happened, or that this is why they like this kind of thing. So it's showing us more about the character. And not just that, it's also helping us realize how other actions that have happened in the story has also happened, how they are all related together. So I would say that there's a balance between telling and showing. The story does not have to be just all telling, and it does not have to be all showing. There has to be a balance between the both of them for you to have a cohesive or a comprehensive work. Thank you. I just hope that answers your question. All right. So any other question or any other comments from Oh, Chukwemeka. Sure.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm so sorry I joined the class late. I met this session when we were discussing language style. And but my question borders around the point of view aspects we discussed. So is it possible possible to switch between points of view, between narratives? Because when you were saying, according to the examples you laid out, you said you will try different points of view and then see eventually one that works for you. But I'm not trying to ask, is it possible for you to employ different points of view? How do I mean? In plot development, you can. Is it possible to employ maybe different points of view in certain plots and then in the end maybe tie them up? So that's the question I want to ask. Thank you. Or is it a must remain consistent? That's the question I want to ask. Thank you.
So if I understand your question correctly, like, is it possible for you to use the first person singular and use the third person in the same story, right? So what I would say is, so most often that, or throughout the course of this whole talk that I've been given it in the terms of short fiction writing, right? So it is possible to use different points of views when you're writing a longer form work like a novel, for example. So I've seen novels that started off with a first person point of view, and then in the next chapter they explore they explore the story via the third person point of view. Novels like Akweke Mezi's Death of Vivek Oji, for example, right? So, so novels like Akweke Mezi's The Death of Vivek Oji does did that. But then when you're writing short fiction, right, which is what my focus has been about all this one, when you're writing short fiction, I don't think it is wise or necessary to use two different um, point of views. When I was describing Nabokov's story, when I'm what I was referring to about a switch in narratives, not point of view, right? So the switch in this character's ability, this character's description of the story to the other character's description of the story, right? So there are two characters. Something about how, well, if you read Nabokov's story, you would eventually discover what I'm talking about. Something about when the wife started describing the story. It's always in the third person POV, but in the third person POV that is used is not the limited third person POV. It's the omniscient. So the third person, or rather, it's limited, but then it switches between the both characters, right? So when the wife is describing the story through in third person voice, she's describing also, we're able to see what is also happening in her own head, right? So we're able to see her expressions, her thoughts, her other things that are not physical, right? And then when the husband starts describing the story at the point where they part in the sanitarium, so we start seeing the story through the husband's head too. But then it still retains the third person POV, right? So you can't, I mean, and the reason why it's not is not really possible or is not really necessary to do this, to switch between first person to the third person in the same story, is because you kind of tend you we will eventually lose your readers in the process, right? So short fiction is short fiction. It's not long form work. There is a reason why it's short fiction, because it condenses and it deals with a time span. That is why you barely find short fiction that spans for years, right? Or short fiction that takes into account different generations of people. So short fiction focuses on one on a particular on a circumscribed idea, right? A circumscribed event. So it's all encapsulated within this particular time frame that does not shoot beyond say like does not shoot very far, because you tend to lose your readers if you start introducing elements that are very confusing, right? Because attention span, that is what people are most concerned about when they're writing short fiction. That is why I also said you have to consider your audience. What I was trying to also talk about when I was speaking of trying out different voices, different POVs for my stories, is that I want to find out which gives me better opportunity to express something, right? So perhaps I want to get into another character's head. I'm not able to do that with the first person point of view. So I try to start the story in a third person POV, right? On a different Google document, right? So in this particular Google document, the story is written in the first person, and then in the second Google document, the story is written in the third person. So the version I'm going to choose, sorry, the version I'm going to use eventually when I'm done with the story is a version that best conveys what I want to see, right? That is the version I'm going to use in the end. That is why it's important that you test out each narrative. So if you start, there's a chance that you start a story with one particular voice and then, oh, it just works. It works perfectly. But then there are other times when you start a story and then you find out that you're having some constraints in describing some events and you have to try out another voice. So whatever eventually works, that is what you're going to choose for you. I just hope that answers your question or clarifies your confusions. Okay, Becca, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to say something fast, but where I am, I'm on transit, so it's noisy everywhere. I hope you can all hear me. On point of view, I heard you say we can't. It's not advisable to use two points of view in one story if it's short fiction. I think I have read, but I'm not sure. But I know I am experimenting on something like that, and it's a kind of conversation between two friends, two very close friends. She's talking to her friend. The friend is not physically there, but it's like she's making a conversation with her friend, and then it goes something like, um, "I told you not to do it, but you did not listen to me. You said you would," like a conversation. Is that not using two points of view also?
So when you're talking about something like that, right? That's why I said is your protagonist is the person describing the story. So she's telling you, like you said, she's talking to a friend. I told you not to do it, right? So it's written in the first person point of view, obviously, but then it's incorporating um and a second character and is referring to another person, right? So it's kind of like I mean that works, but it's not necessarily using two point of views. What using two point of views, if I'm to be more elaborate, is so you start out your story writing, for example, as you've said, you start out your story writing, oh, I said this, and then I said that, and then this happened to me, and then this happened outside yesterday to me. And then in the next paragraph or in the next section of that story, you switch it to the third person and starts describing, oh, the song rose yesterday, and this person went out, and blah 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 blah. Right? Why that is not really advisable? Perhaps when you say experimenting, I think it's possible if it serves your story. That is why I always maintain if whatever you are doing with your style, if it serves your story, then in the end, it's fine. Because the point of rules is so they can be broken, as I've always maintained. So that is why rules exist. So if it works for your story, then you can do it. But then reason why it's not usually advisable is because you are bound to lose your readers in the long run, right? I see. Okay, you can go ahead.
Hello?
Sorry, I can barely hear
Hello?
you.
Okay. So I'm trying to say, I think that switch is something that I'm tried. And in my head, I'm thinking it's possible. Why is that so? I'm thinking, okay, it depends on the kind of plot you want to work with. If you're dealing with a linear plot, for
Sorry,
instance,
sorry, I can't hear you. I can't hear
okay,
you. I don't know
I'm
if it's.
I'm saying this the switch between points of view. I'm trying to say it looks possible in the sense that it depends on the plot the kind of plot you have chosen to use. If you're using a linear plot, for instance, then you have to maybe remain consistent with the point of view. But the situation where you're not going to use the linear plot and you have a difference, I'm trying to say it depends on the plot development. So I don't know if that makes sense. So that's the area I'm thinking we should maybe that is possible to explore. So I don't know if someone has more
Yeah,
to say
yeah,
on it. But in my head,
it
I'm
does
thinking
make
that
sense. It
which
does
between
make
points
sense.
of
That is what I've
is
always
possible.
that is what I've always maintained. Sorry, I can't see. Okay, that is what I've always maintained. That as long as it serves your story, right? As long as it helps you achieve what your intentions for your story are, then you can do it. But then also take into account that in short fiction, you have this limited space to explore ideas, to like run through the gamut of ideas or emotions or expressions or whatever it is, or expositions, right? So you have this limited space to work. And then when your story does this flipping between two narratives and then with the intention of coming to the end to tie it all up together, as long as you feel that it serves your story, if it is possible for you to do, that is okay, or that works. But then what I'm saying is, in terms of what is standard practice or what is often common advice, that because of how short fiction is structured, because of how you are battling on what to put in and what not to put in, you might end up losing your characters. But then if you have a story that works, a short story that works between these two points of views, I'll be very happy to read it. Thank you very much. Does any other person have any question or anything they would want clarification on? We're already behind. It's past 4 now. Um, if any other person has any questions or any clarification, you can go ahead. Okay, I'm assuming we're all good. Um, so I'll try as much as possible to send the material across on the group chat and also some of the stories that I've referenced that were not in the schedule. But then I would also advise that you go back and read the stories and try to think about it in terms of all the things that we've discussed this afternoon in this session, and work on the assignments or the exercises in the schedule. And you can send it to the group chat just before the deadline. Um, I think that's all. So thank you all very much. Um, and I hope we all enjoy the rest of our weekend. All right. Bye.